amongst them also World Economic Forum's Future Council on Virtual Reality. And you also were awarded the one or the other award. I think the one of the most recent ones were that you were inducted into the IEEE Virtual Reality Academy earlier this year. So this is a great honor, and I'm really happy that you took the time amongst your parallel workshop, by the way, to talk about with us about a very important topic, which is also related to running user studies and how we can make them better. So Greg, thank you so much for being here, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. It's a luxury for me to be here. I get to get away from organizing my own workshop. No, thank you. So what I want to talk to you about today is something we call VERA. That's how we pronounce it, V-E-R-A. This is, so Jens approached me and Ed and the others asked me to talk about this because this is a project, I'll tell you more about it in a minute, that we've been working on for over a year now. And it's a little unusual because many of you do research proposals. This is really about a research proposal, but it's a really big research proposal. And it's something that the community of researchers in XR has been involved with us for over this year, coming up with ideas, plans, and everything. And so whether or not it gets funded in the way we're planning, we're going to make this work somehow. So my colleagues, there are sort of two groups of people involved in this project. The what would be called the principal investigators, myself, Tabitha Peck from Davidson, Valerie Taylor-Jones, Professor Gerd Bruder, Professor Jeremy Bailenson, and Shiri Azenkot from Cornell. So the six of us did doing most of the heavy lifting and organizing. And then we have another group of awesome people. This is one of the things I want to tell you about that happened over the past year, is finding and getting to meet and getting to work with some of these amazing people. So for example, if just in no order, look down the lower right, Jonathan Beaver is the founding director of a Center for Ethics and Privacy, which is a really fabulous component of this whole project. Professor in statistics whose research is also focused on sampling and sampling theory in terms of like human subject research, basically. Many of you probably know Carolina Cruz-Niera. John Murray, you may or may not know, has done all sorts of work in systems related to the thing I'm going to talk about. And I'll say a little bit more about Nicholas Coles in a little while. He's from Stanford also, along with Jeremy Bailenson. And a couple of folks helping out, my assistant, Natasha, and our colleague at University of Central Florida. All right, so as I said, and by the way, please interrupt if you have questions, in particular, if there's a question of clarity. If you don't understand something, please just raise your hand and I'll stop. So this is the National Science Foundation in the United States has a particular program called the Community Research Infrastructure. SISE is an acronym, Computer Information Science and Engineering. This program is for money to put in place what they call infrastructure. So this is like big systems that would be used by researchers together. So for example, you might ask for money to buy a supercomputer, and a university would install a supercomputer and make it available to people all over the country or the world. We are not building a supercomputer. We're proposing to build a human machine system, which I'll tell you about in a moment. So it was due July 15th. We submitted it, it's pending. It is the United States National Science Foundation, so the focus of the proposal is really the US and everything we've been thinking about, we have to. But we, as those who've been a part of the sessions we've had over the past year, you know that we're going to make it international. So we're going to make it accessible in a variety of ways to folks internationally, and then hope to grow it formally internationally in the future. So when I say community throughout, I mean the XR community. ISMAR, VR, Chi, SIGGRAPH, it's very broad. A little bit of history here. So this is kind of when we started, 2021 June. There's where we submitted. In between, we had, over the past year or so, we had 4 public sessions. One was at ISMAR a year ago. one was at VR, and then a couple that were just freestanding virtual sessions. So 90 minutes or 2 hours of people from the community listening, offering suggestions, comments, helping us shape our plans. Submitted the proposal, it's in, we're waiting. We're here together. This workshop that I'm doing in parallel, so Jens mentioned it, workshop 4, not to try and steal anybody from here, but this workshop, we're doing workshop 4 was planned long ago, and we're executing that now. And then we hope, if funded, approximately January, this would start. All right, so here's the big picture. It's a little complicated. I'm going to break it down a little bit for you. This is the picture that was on the front of our proposal. Of course, in the proposal had a lot of other explanation with it, but let's see if I can. The picture basically has 2 parts, the top and the bottom. So let's look just at the bottom. This is intended to represent how most of us do user studies today. Not everyone, but this is sort of typical. So it would be laboratory based. That's why it says lab based. So most of us, this is United States, here's Florida. So here's around us, for example. We would recruit for a study and we would get people in one at a time. They would sign up, they would come in. The colors are meant to represent diversity. So these would be different, different dimensions of diversity. Notice there are quite a few greens, one blue, occasional yellow. We bring that single person in, they do the experiment, task, we take a bunch of measures, they do everything. One researcher generally is kind of watching this. And so we produce results that are over time, we run person, subject, get some data, produce some results, next study or next group, obviously sequential like that. So sequential, relatively slow, not too many studies, small samples, not very diverse, very difficult to replicate in this case. So now let's look at the top. This is what we're proposing. So you can think of this as sort of crowdsourced or, and there are other people who've done virtual studies like this, but we're bringing together a lot of aspects. So what we would do is have a standing pool of participants. These are people who've signed up and agreed to be with us over a long period of time, years typically. And they would be in their homes. They would each have head-mounted displays, and they would have the procedures and policies. They'd be all set up. They would be getting paid just like subjects who would come to the lab. Okay. And so we have researchers up here. This would be you guys in the future, all of us. We would submit a study. The study tasks would be pushed out to all of the individuals across the country, the world eventually. They would go, I'll show you in a minute, they would go to a place, they would find the studies that are available for them to do. They would pick one, they would do it. All the measures would be collected, everything would come back and be aggregated and made available to the researchers who ran the study and eventually all of the researchers in the community. So unlike the sequential thing here, large groups of people all at once in parallel, fast, relatively fast, all in parallel, concurrent studies, many could be going on at the same time. It's supposed to be represented here. Very diverse, see the collections of all the colors in there. And of course, you can do replication. That's what these circles, the dash circles with the arrows are meant to represent. So we could have the same group of participants repeat the study again later at some time if we wanted, or have them carry out a subsequent part of the same study. So we could do things over time. We could replicate studies. We will know, in modulo people dropping out occasionally, but generally we'll have the same cohort of subjects over a long period of time. And there's some pros and cons to that. I won't go into the details. I'm only sharing most of this with you to kind of give you context. What Jens and others wanted me to talk about today was lessons we learned. And typically lessons I think of are like, we did something wrong and we learned from it. It's not so much that here. These are more, I'm going to tell you about things we discovered, things we came to understand, a few lessons here and there. So it's just interesting tidbits. As I said earlier, it's a proposal. It's all it is right now. So it may or may not get funded. We all feel pretty good about it, but those of us who submit proposals often feel good about them, and that doesn't mean they'll get funded, but we're optimistic about this. We've worked on this for a long, long time. Thousands of people involved in some way, lots of input from the user community, which is really important, and lots of enthusiasm. So we're going to make it happen somehow. So an important philosophical point, we think of this as a power tool, if you will. So this is not intended to replace every other study people would do. We'll still do their laboratory-based studies. This is intended to be an additional mechanism through which people can run larger, more involved, larger numbers, different types of studies. It's an equalizer. That's one way we think about it too. Is so a big part of this effort is not just to make the populations of our studies more diverse and more accessible, but also the researchers who are carrying out those studies. So one of the nice things about this is because you could think of this kind of like, Jeremy Bailenson hates it when I say this, but it's kind of like Mechanical Turk is the idea for user studies. So because it's virtual in that way, somebody who does not have any equipment, a researcher somewhere in the country has zero, could use this to run a study. And I'll tell you in a moment how they could also join up with other people. Our philosophy in what we're proposing is to keep it as simple as we can to start, just immersive virtual reality, no AR, not a lot of different types of headsets, very, very relatively homogeneous. And once we get it up and running and everything's working well, then we will expand it, grow from there. So here's a little, I put this off by itself because this is kind of an interesting, to me, point. There's something a couple of us have talked about over the years. We joke about we call it stochastic debugging. I'm not old enough to remember this. I don't know if any of you are, but does anybody know what this is? Oh, Bruce does. Bruce, I've never actually used these, but I know of them. These are punch cards, okay? The reason I put these up here is because, I was about to say in the old days. In the past, when you had punch cards, when you wrote a program like that, you would think very carefully because the cost of getting it wrong was really high. You get your cards punched, you go to the punch card master, you hand off your cards, you go away, you wait, sometime later a printout comes out and you go back and look at it. If you had a command that was wrong, you're dead. Now you have to wait a long period of time, get the cards done and go all the way back through. So it's really incumbent upon you to get it right the first time. So what happens today, right, when we're all writing programs? It's like, it doesn't work, you get an error and you go like, let me make that variable negative. Let me hit return, compile. Try it. That wasn't it. Let me add 1 to that. Let me try that again. So it's this random, not quite random, but this iterative, very quick debugging kind of thing. So this is like us going crazy, just compile, change, compile. So it's something we've thought about with respect to the whole Vera tool, because it is Mechanical Turk-like. It could be deceptively easy to run a study that could be costly in the grand scheme of things, even though for the user running it, it would be relatively quick. So that's part of the things we struggle with. Struggle's too strong, but one of the things we thought about is how do we balance this care for the resource, which is the money that's running all of this, against not making it really hard for people to use. So we're trying to make it easy for people to use, accessible, but being careful to be good stewards of the money. So I'm not going to say any more about the details of it. You can ask me more later. There's some stuff online here if you're interested. What I will say is, and this is sort of the title of the talk, this is something that for me has been a journey over the past year. I have started out, and ups and downs. I started out really, when I started doing this, there were many times, I'm not kidding you, when I would ask myself, like, do I really want to do this? Because this was a ton of work. I spent a lot of time on this, a lot of people, a lot of effort, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. And there was a long period of time when I kept asking myself, like, why am I doing this? This is like, I don't get anything out of this. Because understand, for those of you who get research grants, this is not a grant for us to do research. Sorry, I'm trying to get away from that wall because I can hear other people talking. It's a little distracting. This is not a grant for us to do research. That's a normal research grant. This is a grant to help us do work to help everyone else. So it's like, why do I want to do that? I mean, I'm a nice guy, but 5 years of like leading this huge thing. So what changed? I mean, a variety of things changed. I'll tell you a little bit. A lot of hard work, spent a lot of time, and just trusting that something was going. I'm an optimist, so I trust that something's going to work out, and we keep trying, thinking lots of creative ideas. And eventually things started falling into place. And it was really stunning to me how many pieces fell into place. The people, the procedures, the policies, everything came together. And so when that started happening, I started to get more excited. I think many of us did. This is a big enabler. So the National Science Foundation, which is a little bit unusual for the National Science Foundation, allows us to spend money to pay people to run this. And then when I realized that, it's like, oh, wow. So we can hire a full-time person to run this whole thing. We can hire staff members to support that full-time person to run this thing. That means that the investigators like myself and the others can be more involved as intellectually managing the whole thing, not so much the day-to-day operations. So that made a big deal. That was a big deal. A couple of mechanisms. This is one of the really interesting things we learned from discussions with people in the community. I'll tell you more in a little bit, but basically nobody wants more work. Anybody else want to do more reviews? I think there are people looking for VR reviewers right now. If anybody's, just itching to do more reviews, come see Bruce or somebody else. I don't know. They'll help you find some review. Yeah, I got a couple. Yeah. So nobody wants more reviews, more work. So it really was, we tried to work really creatively to think about how do we make this happen without burdening people more than they're already burdened. And we had some good ideas, I think. So in the end, I am super excited about the plan we have, the team we have, the people. It's really amazing. And it's just stunning to me how many people in the large community have been really enthusiastic. I don't think we ever got a negative comment other than I don't want to do more reviews. There was a bit of a chorus for that, which we heard. All right. So talking a little bit about DEIA things. We know societally this is important, or many of us do. I believe it is. I'll speak for myself, my co-organizers, my co-PIs. But we also know it's scientifically important. If you haven't read this paper, you might go off and find this. It's Diversify, spelled like that, from Professor Tabitha Peck from Davidson. And she really talks in that paper very well about the effects of not just it seems like the choices of our participants, our subjects in our studies is sort of isolated at study. It's not in the grand scheme of things. It really affects, it's sort of like ripples or cycles. It affects everything in the ecosystem of research. So it's really important scientifically to get better data and to improve the scientific research ecosystem in general. So read that paper if you haven't. This is something, there's another aspect of this we encountered, and it's a bit of a third rail in some sense. You could think of it as that. So should we have policies about the EIA things in terms of our study? So ISMAR this year, if you're an author or you think about being an author and you look at the author guidelines, there are some words about thinking about this. They're trying to get you to think about it. So there are people who wonder, should there be a policy? Should there be rewards? Should there be penalties for, in other words, if I run a study and I submit it to ISMAR and my population is all 20-year-old white men, then is that okay? Maybe it's okay, but maybe I have to be transparent about that. Maybe I have to be very clear when I publish my paper that that's my population. So I can't make claims about it being much more generalizable. So anyway, that's a hot topic discussion. I'm excited we have Jessie Greer, who's a linguist, is with us at the other workshop today. And she's going to help us think about how to just talk about these things, because at least in the US, a lot of times when you start talking about these things, people get all, they get really tense, and it's hard for people to talk about because the words are very charged and have lots of baggage and different things. So she's going to help us think about how we just even have those discussions. One of the big things we discovered, which sort of we knew, but we started to think it through a little bit, was why is it so important to have this large group of people simultaneously in a study from across the US? So hundreds, maybe thousands of subjects all at once. And so one of the things you start to realize, if you look at how many subjects you can or cannot get, depending on how many independent variables you have, the different levels of those independent variables, dimensions of diversity, levels of diversity, any repeated measures, and you realize there's this combinatoric explosion. And so what happens, as you all know, and we all know, everybody shrinks all of these things down, make it just because I can't do more than 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 subjects. So I have to shrink everything down. So it really kind of dumbs down with all due respect to all of us, it's difficult. We're all facing this challenge of this sort of logistical or practical aspect of running a study while also trying to do good science. So a bunch of things we talked about, small sample biases. We hope to be able to get cross-sectional results, more meaningful conclusions, more generalizable, longitudinal. Another discovery. So again, these are just little realizations we had along the way. This is, and we're not the first people to recognize this, but it really became evident to us how much the time is right now to do this. And that sounds like a cliche. I hear that all the time in proposals and papers, but it really feels like it now. So many of you may not remember. I actually remember because when I was a grad student at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, we had for the time, really impressive graphic systems, huge graphic systems, tracking systems, display systems. They were one of a kind in the world. You came to them to do your studies if you wanted to do anything. So they were the only ones. And they were expensive, and it took a lot of high priests and priestesses around to make sure everything worked. And, you know, it didn't work, and they fix it and they get it to work. So it was really hard to maintain. Now, of course, you know, everybody has things in their living rooms, right? Millions of people, just general consumers, and they're not perfect systems, but they're pretty darn good. They can't do everything, but they can do a lot. We can do a lot with them. And the people who use them figured out how to use them by themselves or with customer support, didn't need us. So that's encouraging. Other people have done sort of cloud-based or online studies. There are a lot of people who've done this. COVID, of course, was a big motivator for this. Anthony Steed and a bunch of other people have done work like this over the years. And so one of the things I think I'm most excited about too, and that this again is a realization. I'm trying hard to find the things that we thought were interesting, is that there's this pent up desire and this growing desire among all of us researchers to do better in terms of the science, do more complex science, more representative populations, all of those things, more science, faster, better, all of those things. And there's really no good way for us to do it right now. We're just stuck in this mode of running these sequential studies, you know, one person at a time. And so I'm excited that we might be able to provide a tool that will enable a lot of this, or certainly make it more possible to do some of those things. During so some of the discoveries we had were during our public sessions, we tried to get a sense from the community of what research topics people were interested in the context of Vera, not in general, but in the context of this particular system. If we had it, what would you do? And some of the things that rose to the top were social XR things, social VR in particular, accessibility and adaptability. So how do I make my systems adapt to my abilities at any particular time, which might be situational, might be permanent, something in between. And then there were a lot of people interested in age-related things, children and the elderly. So as a response to that, we went off and changed our plans. And I'll show you in a minute. We have some awesome partners. So XR Access, anybody here who knows about XR Access has heard of it? One of the principals at XR Access, Dylan Fox, is giving a talk right now, I think, in our other workshop. I'll tell you about that in a second. And two particular partners for Area 3. So XR Access is an organization. Shiri is she's one of the PIs on our Vera grant, and she is one of the founders and director of XR Access at Cornell, or she's at Cornell Tech. But so this is an organization funded by the National Science Foundation and a bunch of other organizations whose mission is to, as it says here, make augmented and virtual reality accessible to people with disabilities. So they are not just like techies doing things, but they work with a very large community of people with disabilities and talking to them, listening, getting them involved, figuring out how to do things. So why is this important to us? Oh, I had a story here quickly. I hesitated to put this out here because this is a little bit, you know, maybe embarrassing, or, but I'm actually, I don't know if proud is the right word. So it's, I mean, obviously I care about people with disabilities. I have friends, people in my family. So it's not that I'm like an idiot, but what was interesting to me was Ren Tyler. I don't know if any of you guys know her or have ever talked to her or heard of her. She's affiliated with XRXs also. She and I were having a long discussion once, and long story short, in that discussion, I came around to realizing that in some ways, how can I put this? If there was a user study right now publicized and they were recruiting for subjects, and I read that, and the task said, you must climb Mount Everest in 6 hours, and then, stop and get your heart rate measured every 1,000 feet or whatever, something like that. So I'd look at that, but I go like, that's probably not for me. I don't think I can do that. What I realized was it should be the same for people with disabilities. They should be able to look at whatever the study is that's happening and on their own make a judgment about, can I do that? Can I not do that? Do I want to do that? Do I not want to do that? And no differently than if I would make that decision about anything else. So it's not that they're necessarily a special population that we have to accommodate in all these ways, although we should rethink in order to be more inclusive. But the goal would be that they are just like the rest of us. They're just like any other subject. They make a decision about whether they want to participate or not based on a variety of factors. One of them might be their physical abilities, like their inability to climb Mount Everest, just like me. So that was my little bit of conversion. So there are two things here, of course. The first thing that we want to do, this makes sense. We want to make XR accessible, but that's what XR Access does. But for you guys, the thing that's really more interesting to me is we realize this is, again, that's why the light bulb here. We want to make the studies more accessible. So what does this mean? This means that, first of all, the people in this community need to be aware that the study is happening. They need to be able to read or understand the description of the study. They need to be able to ideally participate if they can. We need to be able to get measures from them. So this means if they can't hear or they don't have sight, we need to be able to ask questions, questionnaires, take other measures in a way that gets information back to them. One of the things that's an interesting example is, and Ren taught me about this, like speak aloud techniques, where you might have the subjects talk about what they're seeing and what they're doing. For someone who can't see and is having to hear what they're supposed to be doing, it's very difficult for them to listen and understand and at the same time talk about what it is they're thinking. So that doesn't work well for them. So it's something else to rethink. We also have a partnership with Sanopi VR. This is a nonprofit spinoff from, this is funny. Do you guys know Ricola cough drop? Right? Ricola commercial, whatever, right? So they have Rico Labs, and they have a variety of things they do. One of the things is they spun off the Sanopi VR, which is VR for the elderly. It's relaxation, cognitive therapy, all sorts of things. So we got a partnership with them if this works out. And then also Melissa at MIT, there's a early childhood cognition lab, and there's a project called Look It, which is part of Children Helping Science. So this is an organization where Melissa's organization runs studies with families who are willing to have their children participate in user studies. They do it over Zoom or over televideo link. So they're also partners in this. They all, more than willingly, all of these partners were enthusiastic about this because they see this as really an opportunity to do several good things. So one of the lessons we learned, or things that I realized as we're doing all of this, is we need to leverage the people who know those populations. And this seems kind of obvious, but it's like, just in general, if you say I want to partner with somebody who knows that population really well, that kind of makes sense. But to link them up with this machinery of Vera is, like, to me, really exciting for a variety of reasons. So yeah, you want to centralize the interactions with them. We want those experts because they know how to talk to those people. They know what's important to those people, what works for them, what doesn't, and the people know them. So it's all good. But so we can get consistency in everything we do. What I'm kind of excited about is, of course, if there's someone who already does, like if Jens already does research with elderly people in VR, this is going to make things better for him because he's going to now have access to all this other thing, this other resource. But the other thing I like is that there may be other people in our community who wish they could do or would be interested in doing something with the elderly, and they just can't because they don't have that population near them. It takes too much effort to put it in place, get to know them. It's just not going to work. But now if it's in place and it's there for them, they can maybe do something, and they can maybe partner with other people who will do something with this community. So it kind of removes all the overhead and the really important but difficult parts of those relationships. So here's something else we thought and learned about, which is our participants. So what's it going to be like for them? So they will access Vera through a meta world, this terminology from Engage XR, who's one of our partners. So one of the things is we really remember they're going to be long-term. They're going to be over there for years, maybe. So we want them to be motivated to come back and do things. So we really have to think about what would it be like for them. So they're going to get paid. They're going to have the ability to come back and get paid again and again and again, do more and more studies. We really realize we want them to feel like they're not just being used, but they're a part of the science. So they're sort of like citizen scientists. They're involved with Vera as part of the team. That's their job. Of course, with that, you have to be a little careful because they have to be objective. We don't want them to be biased, but we don't want them to overthink things. So that'll be an interesting challenge. There are all sorts of things, standing panels for surveys and things that have been done in the past. Many of you know, I'm sure more than I do, various panel effects that can happen, like people become acclimated or they fall out. There are all sorts of effects that can happen. One of them could be time effects. So if we put out like a study, we publish it, there might be people in one part of the world or one part of the country who see it first and they all sign up for it. And then all of our slots are filled. And so people in the other part of the country never get to go. So we'll have to think about time staggering and things like that. We also plan diagnostic studies. We will occasionally run a study that the participants won't know is actually designed to measure what they're doing. So we can measure the timing, like when do they do it? How quickly do they do it? How much do they complete? How much care do they take in different things they're doing? So we'll be running some diagnostic studies. Okay, for you guys, who wants to use this? This is one of the things we figured out that, again, there are many things I was really excited about was how do we pay for this? How do we make this work? The goal eventually for the National Science Foundation for us is that this would be self-sustaining. NSF cannot continue to pay for this year after year after year after year. So they want to bootstrap this. So to start, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. The researchers aren't going to invest a lot of time to use this because they don't know if it works. They don't know if it's going to be, nice, good, bad, whatever. So we're dedicating maybe half, huge part of the budget to just running studies for the community of researchers. So what will happen is everybody will register to get an account who wants to. We'll divide the money up. This will be tricky, but we'll do it. And everybody will get a budget of how much they can use. So I'll take Bruce because he's sitting here. Professor Thomas will have a budget of a certain amount of Vera bucks he can use. So he can run studies, and every study he runs will consume some of his budget. So in order to, we don't want the resources to go away too fast. We have to be careful about that. So we're going to have to see how much interest there is, but that's why we have the budgets, to make sure that people don't go over. It doesn't mean they can't go over, but we just want to, if someone reaches their budget, we want it to be a flag that stops us and says, do we need to give, Professor Thomas some more money or more subjects or not? And we go on from there. Students will always be free, but they have to be with a professor who is not free, okay? So one of the cool discoveries we had too, I really like this, I was super excited, when we realized that if you're going to run a study, it doesn't matter how many investigators are on the study. Costs are still the same. So if Bruce and Jens want to partner, their budgets each only take half the hit. So every professor who joins in, the costs just go down per professor. So there's really encouraging people to team to work together to bring people in because it doesn't cost them anymore. That's exciting. So this I mentioned earlier, Nicholas. Nicholas has anybody here heard of the Science Accelerator? Psychological Science Accelerator, sorry, PSA. So this is obviously psychology community, 1,300 researchers over 84 countries, a distributed laboratory organization, all volunteer, no money. Researchers from like 600 labs around the world work together to carry out something like 4, 5, 6 studies over a year. It's a really impressive organization. They publish papers with hundreds of authors. Give you a sense of how many people work together in this case. There are literally hundreds. It's really amazing. So Nicholas is the director of the PSA, and he's one of our investigators. So he's a wealth of knowledge about how these things run. I think I'll skip over, I don't want to go through the whole process, but the point here is we worked really hard to figure out how to optimize what would be done to use Vera. So virtually everything you would do anyway, even if you weren't using Vera, you're going to do still. And there are only going to be a few things that are going to change. One of the things we want people to figure out how to do is have people publicize in advance what they want to run on Vera. The reason is because we want them to be serious. We want them to think about it, not just randomly go, hey, I think I'll use this. But we also want other people in the community to have enough of an awareness that they can also say, hey, can I work with you guys? I'm interested in that. And, you know, they can work it out individually. So we want teaming. We can do it. This is a really important thing that came out of everything. As I said earlier, in our sessions, we found out that people don't want to do more reviewing. That was loud and clear from people. They don't want more work. So we really step back and try to think about what is it that's so much work? What is it that's so hard about all the reviewing? And what we realized is that in our case, there were two things, two principles. One is that there's a bunch of stuff like, right, we don't want to run a study if it's statistically is a mistake. It doesn't make sense. If we're going to spend a lot of money paying participants and not get meaningful data back. And I don't mean meaningful in the sort of objective scientific judgment. I mean mathematically or, you know, statistically. It's like, does it make sense? So what we realize is because we can have money to pay staff, we can have paid grad students in statistics and a statistics PI just reviewing that part of studies. So they will be responsible for making sure that statistically the study proposal is sound, or at least there are no problems with it they can see. The rest of the volunteer reviewers in the community will not have to do that. They will just see a checkbox or a score that says it's good. And so the judgments then about whether the study is allowed to proceed will be relatively simple. The other principle that makes it even simpler is at some point during this year, we came to the realization that there's sort of two sides you can come down on something like this. One is, I want to check everything you do and make sure you don't do anything wrong. And I'm going to have all these rules. I'm going to have all these things I'm going to check. The other side is, I'm going to let you do whatever you want. And I'm just going to try and make sure you don't ruin the resource. You don't take all the money. So we're falling down more on that second side. So we want researchers to run their studies. It's their money. They're going to have a budget. If they misspend it, that's their problem. They'll have to figure it out, you know, but we just want to make sure they don't, as best we can, that they aren't doing something that's really destructive or financially or otherwise. There's a bunch of IRB stuff in here. Basically, IRBs will be spread out, institutional review boards will be spread out in different places. Anybody wants to talk about this later? Bruce, I want to talk to you about this. I have some ideas. I shared a little bit on a 3DY using mailing list that I've been thinking about. Yes, there's a lot of fun discussion there. And I'm still thinking about this and I'm still excited about some ideas. I don't know if they'll work or not, but I have some ideas for that. So we have the right organizations. I mentioned that was really important. This one's really fortuitous. I think 2 weeks. So we have 10 organizations partnering with us, and they include head mount companies, big companies, and VR companies. I won't name them, but you would know them. There is one particularly big XR company that you would all know, who we wanted to be a partner, and they wanted to be a partner. In the end, it just couldn't work because lawyers, I work with a lot of lawyers, so I'm not against lawyers. It just was too hard to get the legal aspects figured out. But what we did find about 2 weeks before the deadline was XRA. So I discovered XRA. It was a little, many of you probably know, I didn't. Discovered it, talked to Elizabeth, president, CEO, and research director, and it's just fabulous. This is a trade organization that was founded by these big companies, and these are just the founding members here. It now has, you know, I don't know, 60 other companies as members. So this is a really great discovery, I think, for us for this is we want Vera in the future, when it's self-sustaining, to even be used by companies. Maybe companies in partnership with researchers. Maybe they work together on things. Maybe the companies work alone. For us to figure out what the companies need and want, what's important to them, it would be really terrible for us to have to go to Google, go to Meta, go to whoever, like each one of them. It would just, we couldn't do it. It'd just be too much. What they've agreed to do is to be the sort of broker between us. They know what's important to the companies generally, and they can individually talk to the companies and find out what's important to them. Then they can represent Vera. So they are the interface between us and all the companies, which was really, for me, a tremendous discovery. And she was just fabulous. I mean, I got to tell you, it was like 4 days before the deadline, we met. And at the end of the meeting, she said, okay, she said, Greg, and this was just amazing. She said, Greg, I know time is short. I know your deadline's in 3 days. I'm going to do everything I can to get this letter approved by the lawyers, our clients, and get it to you. And the reason that stunned me is because a lot of times when you meet with people like this, they're like, okay, yeah, we'll work on this as best we can. She really got it. She knew the deadline was short. She knew how important it was. She really was excited about it, and she came through. You know, they are a partner. We got a letter from them. It's really awesome. All right, just to sum up some of the things I learned. Bigger can be better. It isn't always better, but it can be better. Economies of scale, of course, that's really helpful to all of us. We can save a lot of money if we all pool our resources. Reducing overhead, power tool, equalizer. This is part of the work savings. And this is what this idea about reviewing papers that I want to talk to anybody who will listen, I want to talk about, is this divide and conquer mechanism for saving, for optimizing work. And then one of the big things that I really am excited about this is how enthusiastic people are and how much people want to be involved, because it's all around good, I think, for all of us. So I really like that we can do something new for this community, which is the big team science idea. Most of us, this is not a criticism of us, just the way it is. We go off and run our little study. We don't work together on big things. And it doesn't mean we have to work together on everything. Right now, we mostly don't work together on much of anything. We do occasionally, but this will be a great opportunity, not just for the Mark Billinghursts and Bruce Thomases and other famous people to work together, but for new assistant professors and grad students at different places to be a part of those teams in a way that is optimal, in that it's cost effective and work effective for everybody. So I'm kind of excited about that. Accessibility. Again, as I said earlier, my conversion, the idea is everybody should have access such that they can make the decision on their own about whether they want to participate or not. And that is it. And I'm happy to take questions if anybody has them. And of course, I'm around all week, so happy to talk more with anybody who's interested. Thanks, guys. Bruce, yeah.
I have a ton of questions. I mean, just off the top of my head, just an observation. What's going to be great about this, if somebody wants to start doing these studies, is they'll get access to experts to help them get their experimental design correct from day one.
Yeah,
which is a huge savings.
Yeah, so sorry, real quick. So that's one thing I forgot, is that during the whole process, you will actually have access to the statistician and grad students, so you can talk to them before submitting your study to try and get it right. Yeah.
But so this is kind of three parts. I'll just fire them off. One is there going to be a repository of shared data? And if so, would that enable meta studies? And two, is there going to be a third, is there going to be a shared repository of the software infrastructure for running it? So if I wanted to check the next gesture interface against the task that was done before.
Yes, and somewhat yes. So the first part of the repository, yes. That's one of the ideas, is we'll collect the data. The data from a study, the general idea at the moment is that the data would be embargoed for the people who ran the study. So they would have access to the data, because their data, for some period of time, and others would not, unless the investigators granted them access. But generally the public would not. Public meaning, when I say public, I mean anybody who's registered within the VERA system. So they've already been vetted. We know they're not nefarious. So then after some period of time, it'll be open to everybody, anybody who can see it. Post hoc analysis, running another study, doing all sorts of stuff with that data if you want. So yes, for that. And we've got plans for data de-identification and all sorts of other things. In terms of the software, the primary tools we're thinking about are the tools for making the studies accessible. So questionnaires, widgets for selection, control, things like that. We'll work with XR Access to make those tools available to researchers so that when they run their study, hopefully they can just use this factor, or this piece for Unity or whatever, that will allow them to do their questionnaire in this way rather than this way. If it doesn't matter to the researchers, then it'll make it more accessible. In terms of the actual software, we plan to archive, like if you run a study, I'm not sure what we'll do with it. We're planning to archive it just to not lose it. In the US, the National Science Foundation makes us do data management plans, like how you can archive the data and make it available to people. It's a really hard problem. You guys know software rot is a real thing, and it doesn't take very long before you can't even, do anything with the data, read it, run the software, doesn't run anymore. So So that's something we're not actually tackling, not the applications, the modules and components for making things accessible. Yes. The actual study applications. No, we're not thinking about that right now. Doesn't mean we won't. It's not on our radar. Yeah. Who else?
Okay, are there more questions? Like in Zoom, I guess, right? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Ed, yes.
You heard me. Cool.
Mhm.
Greg, how is this different? Oh, look, there's me. Man, I'm big. How is this different than Mechanical Turk? And I guess an advantage of Mechanical Turk is that it has a business model that, you know, makes it sustainable since it makes Amazon some money. So you said Jeremy Bailiton doesn't like that. Anyway, just what are your thoughts about that and the sustainability of this idea?
So let me say sustainability first. We have to make it sustainable, and we have to convince NSF that we're going to make it sustainable. We have a plan. There's no guarantee, but we do have a plan. We actually have more planning than most people do when they submit this. So we've done all sorts of modeling of all the costs, all the staff, of all the people paying the participants. And honestly, our models, which I think are pretty conservative, have the per participant cost coming out, and this is including some profit, less than we at my university pay subjects right now per hour. So, I mean, again, it's an economies of scale. So it should be sustainable. I'm not sure about huge profits, but from a nonprofit sustainable standpoint, we believe it should be, and we will find out. We have economists, we have some business people on the team. We have people who have agreed to work with us to help us figure all of that out. But back to your first question, Mechanical Turk. Mechanical Turk is, Turkers are, there are a lot of differences. One is they're very opportunistic. They're doing very small, short tasks. Of course, Mechanical Turk has a lot of problems or has problems related to the reliability of the subjects. You don't know who they are. You don't know if they're just, you know, eating pizza, tapping the keyboard with their toes. You don't know what they're doing. You have no idea what they're doing. And so you have to be ready for data to be just crap when you get it back. You have to be ready for that and be able to figure out how to try and sort that out. So what we will have, we'll have participants who we have long-term relationships with who know, do you guys know who, what's the British company? Prolific. Have you heard of Prolific? So Prolific is one of our partners too. They've agreed to work with us. They're going to give us a discount. We're going to start with them probably, and then we may grow our own pool in addition. So Prolific has, what they do is they just have a huge collection of participants for any study you want to do, basically mostly questionnaires and things that they can do in their homes. But these are long-term relationships with all of their participants. So they know them, they're vetted, they know all of their demographics, that you can select from them carefully. They're not going to waste your time. They know that it's important. So those are some examples of how it's different from Mechanical Turk. We have to have people who have head mount displays. We want to know they have the same kind, or at least we want to know what kind of head mount displays they have, not just some random people who we don't trust and don't know are going to faithfully execute the task that we've given them. That make sense, Ed?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I think there is a further question.
So, hi, Greg. Thank you.
I earned up.
Hey. I have a quick question about this for the diversity and inclusion. If any university or any professor wants to run a study with a particular group of people with certain accessibility needs, so how can this group can support that? So that's one question.
Okay.
And the second question is, how about if we want to include people from like researchers from countries which may not pay the equal amount of money to that other researchers in the US or Germany can pay? How are you planning to include them in that?
Okay, so thanks, Aaron. So the first question, the way it would work, we envision, is that again, like say Sanofi or Look It with children or XR Access or some other population, is that we would have this liaison. So people who submit a proposal would say, they would specify the population they're interested in, and it might be specifically that population. And we'll have to figure out the exact details of how we do that interaction, but we will work with that person to, if it's specialized to that population, we'll work with that population to get the study to those participants, get the data back. But again, they'll be longer term members of the team, if you will. So it won't just off like, hey, have you got some time this week? I want you to do something. If it's the general study, like just anybody, Bruce or anybody, you, Aaron, I'm running a study, and we want to include these populations, then they will just get the tasks or the studies like everybody else. And they'll be able to do them or not do them. And the liaisons of the people who are the representatives of those communities will make sure that they have them and work with us to help get it right. So I hope that answers that part. The second part about the money, we don't know. Again, to begin with, it's all I could do to deal with it's not a criticism. I'm just saying the simplest thing first and make that work. It is our goal to make it big. I don't know if the right model is a centralized thing, like Vera in the US suddenly serves the entire world, or whether there are Vera satellites that work together and they're maybe regional to parts of the world where the people who are running it know the populations better, time zones, all of that. And we work together to share participants, just like PSA does. They have participants all over the world. So it's very asynchronous. Theirs is very asynchronous. What we're thinking is much more synchronous, right? It's asynchronous and synchronous in time or concurrent, run 1,000 subjects all at once everywhere. PSA will say, we want 1,000 subjects sometime over the next 4 months. And individual researchers will, not at their leisure, but kind of figure that out. So yes, we want to try and accommodate all of that. I think the decisions about payment, remuneration, all those things would have to be specific to the region, the culture, the people, and we'll just have to see. Thank you. Good questions.
Okay, are there maybe any last short question? Yes or no? I'm just looking around. And if not, you can maybe take the time to talk to Greg in one or the other break. Greg, I want to thank you once more for this great talk, for giving us this introduction, and thank you so much. Let's give Greg a hand. And with that, now it's time for the break, and we see each other back in about 20 minutes. Thank you so much. See you then for the tutorial on a replication crisis. Thank you so much.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about the replication crisis, reproducibility and inferential statistics, and then cover in some detail a project called the Reproducibility Project in Psychology. This is the presentation for the second workshop on replication and extended reality. And I'm pleased to get to present this tutorial. It's a subset of a longer tutorial that I first organized as a half-day tutorial. And I first gave it at VR 2018 in Reutlingen, and have given variations of the tutorial at various times since then at VR and at ISMAR. And I want to thank especially the workshop organizers, Florian, Farina, Jens, Arifin, for extending these ideas into a workshop and allowing me to present them in this format. So I'm going to talk in this presentation about the replication crisis, and then the reproducibility project in psychology, and then what it means and what we should do. So that's the organization. So what is the replication crisis? So a major goal of science is reproducibility. Run an experiment and the results should be reproducible the next time the experiment is run. So for example, your car, if you own a car, it worked yesterday, you expect that you go in and you turn the key and it's going to work again tomorrow. A drug has a certain effect in an experiment, and if you take that drug to cure that illness, then you want it to work in your body as well. And so something relevant to work that's happened in my laboratory, we see that a virtual object is perceived to be in a certain location, and we hope it is in the same location whenever anybody else looks at it, within some sort of error boundary, of course. So the replication crisis was first reported on about 10 or 12 years ago in a series of articles. So here's one from the Atlantic. And as you can see, it was about medical researchers not being able to reproduce effectiveness of drugs and similar things. Trouble at the lab. Why most published research findings are false. This is a very interesting paper. All of these papers are cited at the end of this talk, by the way. How much can we rely on published data on potential drug targets? Cancer research in crisis are the drugs we count on based on bad science. And finally, this is the most despondent of all of these articles. Big science is broken, by a guy who thinks we should stop giving research money to anybody over the age of 30. He apparently doesn't realize that in most academic labs, most science is actually conducted by people who are no older than their early 30s typically, but whatever. So that is the replication crisis. So what is the problem that all of these papers are talking about, all of these articles? So they're talking about the failure to replicate many published findings, even textbook findings. And why would this be? The hypothesized reason, which we will spend this time thinking about, are various research biases. So one of the main ones is the publication bias. So typically, only significant results have been published, where significance is operationalized as a p-value less than 0.05. Because of that, there is a selection bias. Only significant results are selected to be analyzed. If the result isn't significant and the paper will be rejected, then why spend all the time to analyze it? And that leads to a reporting bias. The only results discussed in a paper would be the significant ones. So because of this, replication studies, which by definition may not replicate, are rarely funded and rarely published. And there's little incentive to do them. So most conducted studies are exploratory in nature. So that's the problem in a nutshell. Are there any thoughts or questions about this? Okay, so thanks for answering that, Verena. So let's talk about some of the evidence that we have for this. So in cancer biology, in this field, there were a number of problems noticed by large pharmaceutical companies in, say, the 2010, 2011 timeframe. And one analysis found that 95% of cancer drugs were failing when they moved to clinical trials. So this is extremely expensive. Clinical trials are very expensive to run. Many hundreds or thousands of people are recruited for these studies, and to have a success rate of 1 in 20 is, very bad. So this led to some replication studies on drug effectiveness. And in other fields, additional replication studies followed. And so here are some of the findings from those replication studies. So Bayer, a large pharmaceutical company, found that it could only replicate 21% of the findings for in cancer biology and other medical areas. Amgen, another large pharmaceutical, could only replicate 11%. The National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke could only replicate 8%. Check out this next one, the ALS Therapy Development Institute. That's arterial lateral sclerosis, also called Lou Gehrig's disease. 0% of the therapies replicated, like 0 out of 47 potential therapies. So that's terrible. And then the project that we're going to consider in some detail today, the reproducibility project in psychology, only 36%. So this is the evidence for the problem. So replication studies were conducted in the fields of biomedicine and in psychology. In addition to that, there was survey data based on this question: have you failed to reproduce somebody else's experiment? This was a questionnaire, a series of questionnaires that was distributed pretty widely, again, about 10, 11 years ago. And here is the percentage of people saying yes in some different fields. So as you can see, in a variety of fields, 87%, 77, 69, 67, 64, 62% failed to replicate somebody else's experiment. So more evidence for the problem. So now let's talk for a minute. Let me ask if there are any questions about what has just been said. Okay. How many people are there, Verena? Can you tell me that approximately? About 20. Well, thank you for being there. And I can see that some people are online. At least I hope that there's actually somebody there. So this slide and some of the ones that follow begin to think about kind of philosophical questions related to replication. So here's another way of expressing the importance of replication. So in 350 BC, Aristotle, Greek philosopher, sought to explain some observed natural phenomena, such as why objects fall to earth. He noticed, as any of us will notice walking around in the world, that light objects, like a feather, like a leaf, fall slowly, more slowly than heavy objects, like a rock. And this is apocryphal. We don't know if Aristotle actually saw a feather in a rock, but these are the objects of the legend. At the time, of course, there was no evidence, no tradition of experimental science. So the philosophers would just observe the natural world and think about it. So Aristotle concluded that heavier objects fall faster than light objects. In other words, he concluded that acceleration is proportional to mass in a gravitational field. Now, we know today that this is wrong. Aristotle did not consider the effect of air resistance, but this was an accepted theory for 2,000 years. That's a long time for this to be an accepted theory. So later, Galileo in 1600 AD, 2,000 years later, he tested Aristotle's theory by dropping things from the Tower of Pisa. And according to the legend, he eventually dropped a musket ball and a cannonball at the same time. So these are objects with similar densities and similar shapes, and therefore similar air resistance. And he found that they fell at the same rate, even though one was clearly much heavier than the other one. Now, this is also apocryphal. We don't know if this is exactly what he dropped or if the Tower of Pisa is where he dropped them. But he correctly concluded that objects fall at the same rate. There is a constant acceleration according to the gravitational field. So this is an example of the power of replicating a known experiment. Now we're going to go to 1971, and you're going to hear some commentary by astronaut David Scott. He was the commander of Apollo 15. That was the last mission to land on the moon, the last manned mission. And what he's about to show you happened at the end of the last moonwalk. And I hope that the sound from my computer also comes through, because there is sound on this little video here.
Well, in my left hand, I have a feather. In my right hand, a hammer. I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago made a rather significant discovery about falling objects in gravity field. And we thought that where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that?
Okay, so he dropped a hammer and a feather. The video quality is not great, but that's the best that can be found of this experience. And they fell at the same rate, and you can see that they fall slowly because the moon has 1/6 of the gravity of Earth. Notice that he said one of the reasons we got here today. There he is referring to the scientific process. If the scientific process was not valid, none of the technology that is behind him would have worked reliably enough to get him there, and it wouldn't have worked reliably enough to get him back. We could say similar things about the technology in a car. It's an amazing bunch of technology. The computers that reside in our pockets at all times now. These are concrete examples of the power of the scientific method. Any thoughts about this? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about the reproducibility project, psychology. So recall this table from earlier. Only 36% were replicated in this project. So we're going to study the reproducibility project, psychology, because the methods and findings are closest to what we use in human subject studies. So this was begun by this fellow, Brian Nosek, University of Virginia, in 2011. And the project replicated 100 published studies. And he recruited a very large team. The final paper has 270 co-authors on it. And I'm going to pause the slides for a minute and show you this paper. Take me a minute to pull it up. And Zoom is putting stuff in the way of my other controls. So I have to look to move them out of the way. I think I just killed something. Okay, so now I've opened up two files that need to be open, and let me try to reshare my screen. I don't think it's being shared anymore. It is, I see it's being shared. Okay. So this is the paper, the reproducibility project in science. And notice the author here, open science collaboration. If we go to the back of the paper, we can see here the open science collaboration. We make it larger perhaps. So here are all the authors, and you can see that Brian Nosek, the organizer, is just in the middle, listed alphabetically. And then here are all of the places where these authors come from. So a very interesting way that this paper is organized. You know, the most authors that I've really seen on a paper that I carefully read. So those are the 270 co-authors. And the first goal was to figure out what studies to replicate. And the group wanted to minimize selection bias, maximize generalizability. And so they published a sampling frame and a selection criteria. So before doing anything, they talked about what they wanted to do. And so that is the other paper that I wanted to show you. And that is this. No, I'm sorry, that's the paper I just had open. It's the other paper by them, which is this one. So first, they published this paper where they talked about what they were going to do. And then 3 years later, they published the final paper where they did the thing that they talked about doing. So that is the reproducibility project, psychology. So now we're going to cover parts of this in some detail. So they covered 3 leading journals: the Journal of Psychological Science, that's considered a premier outlet for all psychological science; the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, that's considered a leading journal in social psychology; and then the Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory, and Cognition. And that's considered a leading journal for studies in cognitive psychology. So the goal of these journals, let's see, so they chose the first 20 articles in each journal, then 10 more. They began with the first 2008 issue, and they always sought to replicate the last study in the article, unless for some reason that was not feasible. So 84% of those replicated were the last study. And the results of the study had to be a single inference test, usually a t-test, an f-test, or a correlation. And if available, they sought to use original materials. And they also sought design feedback from the original authors. And because these were being repeated, it was possible to establish statistical power from the initial experiment. And so there were always enough participants for a statistical power of at least 0.80. That's the amount suggested by Jacob Cohen and other people who have been concerned with issues of power and issues of minimizing type 2 errors. That's where something was there, but your experiment failed to find it. So they wanted to select results that were new enough so that the original team was still available to consult, but old enough to have some meaningful indication of a citation impact. And so there were 488 articles in these issues of these 3 journals. 158 fit their replication frame. 113 were selected to be replicated, and by chance, exactly 100, so a very even number. By chance, exactly 100 replications were completed by the deadline they had for these replications. So now there was the problem. How do we measure a replication? How would a replication be measured? How do we quantify a series of replications? So each experiment was analyzed with some standard R packages. Sorry, my slides are not advancing properly. Maybe this is how. And each analysis was performed independently by a second team. So a team of scientists would analyze an experiment, and then they would run an experiment, conduct an experiment, they would analyze their data, and then a second team would also take their data and run an independent analysis. And so here are the characteristics that were examined. So for the original study, the p-value of that study, of that hypothesis test, was examined. Then the effect size was computed. The degrees of freedom were examined, or the sample size. If it was a between subject study, then the sample size in terms of number of participants and the degrees of freedom were closely related. If it was a within subject study, then the degrees of freedom would be larger than the number of recruited participants. The result was given an importance rating by all people who participated in the project. The results was given a surprisingness rating. This is very interesting what happened regarding the surprisingness rating of these experiments. And then the experience and expertise of the original team was rated. So the replication studies had many of the same characteristics: the p-value, an effect size, degrees of freedom. Power was available for the replication, always at least 80.80. The replication was ranked according to how challenging it was, the experience expertise of the replicating team, and then the quality rating was also examined. So here are the results. So let me talk these over. So 100 experiments replicated. Here we're looking at the p-values along the y-axis. And along the x-axis, we have the p-values for the original studies and the replications. So these are violin plots where the width at each point is proportional to the number of p-values that are at that level. So for the original studies, the p-value was less than 0.05 by definition, except for 4 that had a p-value of 0.06. So you can see there's a tiny amount, of energy above this line that indicates 0.05. For the replications, the p-values had quite a wide range. This dot here is the median p-value. And then we see the quantiles as well. So the paper contains several different statistical tests, but the result is visually obvious from this graph. Replications had much higher p-values than the original studies. So 97 of the original studies had a p-value of less than 0.05, that magic number. 35 of the replications had a p-value of less than 0.05. That's a very, very statistically significant difference in number of p-values. Here's another way of looking at the same results. So again, we have the original studies and the replications, and here we're looking at effect sizes. So here the effect sizes have been turned into correlations. Correlations go between -1 and 1. And the original studies, according to this calculation, were always expressed with a positive effect size. So if the prediction of the experiment flipped in sign, then the effect size in the replication became negative. In other words, if some test would be the number of answers that were positive, and then in the replication, the hypothesis was that this intervention would make that number grow. And the original study found statistically significant growth in the number of positive answers. But in the replication, the number of positive answers decreased, then that would show up as a negative effect size. And so here the result is also visually obvious. The effect size of the replications significantly declined. Out of 99 replications in this graph, the effect size went down for 82 of them. Any thoughts about this? Questions, observations? These numbers are pretty shocking. Okay. This is a third way of looking at the results. So here we have all the experiments and replications as on a scatter plot. So down here on the x-axis, we have the original effect size. And up here, we have the distribution of the original effect sizes. So this is another way of visualizing this data right here. Another way of visualizing it. And so here, very small, we have the distribution of the original effect sizes that did not show up as being significant, not 0.05 or less. Along this axis, we have the replication effect sizes. So the ones that replicated as being significant and the distribution of the ones that did not. This dotted line here, this is the replication effect size of 0. And so everything in the original was 0 or above, but some of the replication ones had negative effect sizes. This line here is the one-to-one line. So dots along this line represent studies where the replication effect size was equal to the original effect size. And so dots that are above this line indicate replications where the effect size increased. And dots below the line, the replication effect size decreased. And then the final p-value was significant for the cyan shaded dots and not significant for the red shaded dots. So here you can see that many more experiments did not replicate compared to those that replicated. And then we even have, based on dot size, an indication of the replication power. So the story is the same for all three graphs. Replications were much less powerful than the original studies. So now we're going to look at some more aspects of the results. In this case, by percent replicated. So the initial strength of evidence predicted replication success. If the original study had a very low p-value, 0.001 or lower, 63% of those replicated. If the original study had a p-value of 0.02 or lower, 41%. Between 0.02 and 0.04, 26%. And 0.04 or higher, only 18%. So the initial strength of the evidence predicted replication success. Maybe that's not surprising. Here's something that is controversial You can tell when reading the paper that this result got some people excited. Cognitive psychology was more successful than social psychology. So 50% of the cognitive psychology experiments replicated, only 25% of the social psychology results replicated. So why is this? There were weaker original effects in social psychology, and cognitive psychology features more within subject repeated measure. So more results, main effects were more successfully replicated than interactions. So 47% of the main effects replicated and only 22% of the interactions. So main effects typically have more power than interactions, and this shows that as well. Finally, here are some very interesting results by correlation with replications. So surprising effects were less reproducible. The more surprising the result, the less likely that it could be reproduced. Journals and conferences like to publish results that are surprising, that are controversial, but those are less likely to be real effects. Experiments that were rated as challenging, those were also less reproducible. That also makes sense. Unsurprisingly, if it's difficult to conduct the experiment, it's, you're trying to measure something that's difficult to measure. The original importance of the result had little effect. So it did not really matter if the original result was rated as important or unimportant. The team experience and expertise had almost no effect. So correlation is very close to zero. The replication quality had almost no effect. The positive effects, notice these are all negative effects. The positive effects are what we have already seen. Larger original effect sizes were more reproducible, and larger replication effect sizes were more reproducible. And then more powerful replications were also more reproducible. So to summarize, even though the replications used materials from the original authors, were reviewed in advance for their methodology, had high statistical power to measure original effect size, replication still produced weaker evidence for the original findings. The strength of the initial evidence, the p-value, the effect size, that did predict replication success. The characteristics of the team in the original finding had no impact on replication success. Are there any thoughts about this so far? Is anyone surprised that so few of these could be repeated? Still no, okay. So why were there so few? The leading explanation has been reported. Biases in the publication, selection, and reporting. So the effect size of the original studies were inflated. Where the replications, because they were all planned ahead of time, all results were reported. There was no publication bias. All confirmatory tests were based on pre-made analysis plans. So there was no selection and reporting bias. Everything that was measured was analyzed and reported. So the lack of biases are likely a big part of the reason why there were so few replications. So what does it mean? What does this mean? Now things get more philosophical. What does it mean? So why would the following happen? There is a study and it has a finding. We'll call it A, but the replication does not find A. So why is this? Why can this be? There are 3 reasons why this could be, 3 explanations. The first would be that the original study is wrong. In that case, A is not true. So that would explain this. The original study found an effect, replication did not find it. Why? Because the effect, A, is not true. It could also be that the replication is wrong. So in that case, A would be true. So the original study found A is true, replication was wrong. But the third, this is the most interesting way to think about it. Both the original and the replication study are correct. If this is the case, then A could be either true or false. And the fact that 2 studies have been run are not enough to establish the truth or falsity of A. So how could this be the case? How could it be the case? So some reproducibility scholars, such as Brian Nosek, believe that number 3 is the most common reason for something to not be reproducible. So remember this story from the beginning of the tutorial. So here, the original study was correct considering air resistance, which Aristotle did not consider. He didn't know about it. But the original study was correct. The stone did fall faster than the feather. The replication was also correct, considering air resistance, the 2 metal balls. So both were correct studies. In this case, where A was Aristotle's original theory, A was false. But both the original and the replication study were correct. So when something cannot be reproduced, it's a deeper issue than either the original study is wrong or the replication is wrong. It's a deeper issue than that. So other reasons for a lack of reproducing a result, first impressions are often false. And it can be hard to detect the difference between a real result and noise. Also, if enough hypothesis tests are conducted, you can usually find something. Now, this can be controlled statistically a little bit with something called the family-wise alpha level, as discussed in experimental design textbooks like Howell. But the main reason for a lack of reproducing results is that the incentive structure of science does not maximize the yield of true results. So the incentives result in many exploratory studies. Exploratory studies generate publications, generate research funding, jobs that pay salaries, result in graduating, result in career advancement. So this is true for every field of science. It's true for our field of science and every field of science. So if a finding is spurious, we won't find evidence until a replication is attempted. So let's consider what this means. A study has a finding, A, and the replication finds A. What does this mean? Statistically, that's the definition of a reliable effect. A is a reliable finding. But what about the theoretical explanation for A? The explanation might still be wrong. That was the case in this example. Aristotle's explanation was wrong, even though A was a reliable finding. So understanding the reasons for A, the theoretical explanation for A, that requires multiple investigations. These investigations provide converging support for the true theory, and they rule out alternative and false theories. And this brings up perhaps the most philosophical idea of all in this tutorial. How many studies should be reproducible? Is 36% too small? Who thinks this is too small? Does anyone think it's too small in the room? Two think it's too small.
This is like 10% or now even less because more people joined.
Oh, okay. What would 100% reproducibility mean? What would that mean? Okay. So 100% reproducibility would mean that we're never surprised. That would suggest that we always know what's going to happen and why it will happen. That raises the question, why are we running these experiments in the first place? So progress requires both innovative new studies and replication studies. So exploratory studies examine innovative new ideas. Confirmatory studies would be replications. So the innovation points out the ideas that are possible, but the replication points out the ideas that are likely. And we need both for progress. We need both. So the incentives, to the degree that they can be controlled, funding, publication, awards, advancement, should be tuned to encourage an optimal balance between exploratory studies and confirmatory studies. So the question at the top of the slide, how many should be reproducible? In terms of a number, it's impossible to know. 36% seems like a pretty small number to me, but 100% would also not be the right number. And so that brings up the last set of thoughts. What should we do about this? So my claim, which I've made whenever I've presented this tutorial, is to value replication studies. And we operationalize value by accepting them if they're well done. We should also value exploratory studies. And exploratory studies are already valued, so need to still value them. The point is to value studies that are well done, regardless of the type of the study or the results. So that requires changing our incentive system. As people collectively running this conference, and many of us are also involved in other conference communities, we cannot directly control things like how our funding agencies work how the advancement systems in our places of employment work, but we can change things like how our review system is conducted. So one thing that we can do, and I think the ISMAR community and the VR community has started to do to some degree over the past 5 years or so, is to have a little less emphasis on surprise in results. So I've seen some language in the call for papers about this in both communities. So my own experience involves more than 25 years of writing and publishing empirical research. And I've served as a program chair a number of times now in the ISMAR community as well as the VR community. And I've seen in that experience too much emphasis on novelty and surprise in the review process. So here are 3 comments that I received on papers that I submitted at various times in my career. All of these were from negative reviewers. All of these were from reviewers who were arguing that the paper should not be accepted. And I will say that not all of these papers were rejected, but not all of them were accepted. And I'm certainly not saying that my paper should always be accepted. And my papers are not always accepted. So, you know, that is the case. But notice that all of these are making a negative comment based on the idea that the reviewer is not surprised by the results. And so this is something that we can do, is try to have a more nuanced judgment of the importance of surprise. And I will again mention that a lesson from the reproducibility project in psychology was that surprisingness of results were negatively correlated with the ability to reproduce the findings. So it's up to us to value replication studies. If they are accepted, they will come. Another idea is to pre-register research plans. So before collecting the data, create a plan, the hypothesis, the methods, the analysis. This removes the possibility of p-hacking. That's the term for measuring a bunch of things, seeing which ones have a significant p-value, and then just reporting those things. Even better than creating a research plan ahead of time is to publicly pre-register it. So there's a group called the Center for Open Science that was founded by people who are behind the reproducibility project in psychology. And I'm going to show you that website now. So this is the Center for Open Science. And this has been around for about 6 years. And now when I look at it, I see that they are celebrating 500,000 users of this website. And so on this website, experiments can be pre-registered and results can be linked and data can be uploaded and things like that. And so we can see a few initiatives that this organization has. Consciousness research grants. That looks pretty cool. So another suggestion is to try to run larger studies, more experiments, more experimental power. The reproducibility project in psychology found that more powerful studies were more reproducible, but of course they're more expensive. This really follows on nicely from what Greg Welch just was talking about. The opportunity to have more participants and also more diverse participants in an experiment. So another practical suggestion is to describe the experimental methods in more detail to make it easier to replicate. The problem in our field, and other fields too, is limited page counts. But there are many solutions to this lack of detail in terms of the experimental methods. So a simple solution is to have additional details available. If the experiment was done as part of an associated thesis or dissertation, then those documents typically have many additional details that the paper cannot be made long enough to fit. We could also choose to adopt longer page limits, but there are some advantages to forcing papers to make their point and move on within a certain number of pages. Another idea that is used by some communities, such as the journal Nature, a pretty well-respected venue, is to have the main paper in a bigger font and the methods in a smaller font that actually follows the discussion of the paper. So let me show you an example of this. So here is a paper that is meaningful in terms of distance judgments. That was in the Journal of Nature. And so you'll notice here, there's an abstract. And then we're right in on the experiments. And this is what was studied and what the findings were. So there's no details about the experimental method given here. And so here are the hypotheses and things like that. And at the end of the paper, after the paper has been read, here's the methods. So if you want to replicate, you need to read the methods. Notice its position in the paper and the smaller font. And so what this suggests is, when working on an empirical paper, first of all, write your paper in such a way that a reader can skip the methods section and still understand what was studied, what was found, and what it means. So that's like a level of abstraction of reading a paper. And then here, the idea is to put the methods at the end of the paper. So that's an interesting idea that I had not seen before that paper. So another idea is to upload materials to various open repositories. That also makes replication easier. And so here are some of the places where that's possible. I showed you the Center for Open Science. The transactions on visualization and computer graphics, they have a replicability stamp, and that's explained here. There is also IEEE Dataport, IEEE Code Ocean. There is Archive and many other preprint servers, other repositories. And so I'll show you a few of those now. And so here's the replicability stamp from TVCG. Now, I will mention that this is not as much about repeatability of empirical experiments. It's about repeatability of algorithms of code. And this replicability stamp first came out of the graphics replicability community. So the idea here was, we have these graphics papers and they have algorithms in them. Can you actually run the algorithm again? And so there are virtualization methods and online methods that allow that to happen. That also, IEEE also has data port. And here you can upload different data sets and different analyses of those data sets. And then it is archived there for perpetuity. So you archive to some sort of a venue that say Google is hosting or something like that. Is it going to be there in 5 years, 10 years, 100 years? As Greg Welch said, you know, code rot. Is it really going to be there? Here, IEEE is an organization that is dedicated to archiving things in perpetuity. So through the digital library right now, we can go look up papers from 100 years ago. Hopefully in 100 years from now, we'll be able to look up papers, our predecessors, successors will be able to look up papers from 200 years ago, maybe including some of our papers. So, you know, there's this promise to archive in perpetuity at these places. And then a related place is called the Code Ocean. So that's another IEEE initiative. And it's to archive code and allow it to be reproduced. So these suggest some reasons for optimism. So the zeitgeist among journals, funders, scientists, the fact that this tutorial has turned into a workshop suggests that many are paying more attention to the issue of replication, statistical power, p-hacking, things like that. In psychology, journals have begun publishing pre-registered studies, and other collaborative replication efforts have occurred. There's the Center for Open Science, and these are the references for this talk, and I'm going to make the slides available at this location very soon, maybe in the hour or so after the next talk is finished. And I would be happy to take any questions about what we've been discussing.
Okay, Ed, thank you so much. And let's first of all thank Ed for your talk. Thank you so much. And are there any questions or comments on this tutorial? Yes.
Thank you, Ed. You might have covered, sorry, I came in the middle of your talk, but you were talking about, sorry? Oh, Bruce Thomas, University of South Australia.
That's right. This is strange because I can't see who's talking.
Oh, sorry, Ed.
Yeah, I can tell from your voice that it's you.
The question is you talk about you know, like a lot of my psychology friends, a big thing to do is to reproduce a psychology experiment, and then that gets published in a respected journal. And the question comes in, are there enough venues for people to publish AR, XR, VR work? Because we don't have a lot of respected journals in our area, and we only have, you know, we have a number of conferences. So do you think we have enough places to actually put this extra work?
Well, it depends on whether it's extra work or it's just part of the work.
No, not extra work, extra publications.
Well, I don't know that these would be extra. I mean, I think it might take as long to replicate an experiment and do a good job of it as it might take to do an experiment in the first place.
Because personally, I think all the stuff that was done 20 years ago needs to be redone with modern technologies, especially, you know, just the screen resolution, tracking, weight, all these other ergonomics. What we found 20 years ago might not hold today.
Yes, that's a beautiful idea. I totally agree. And I've seen that idea, also discussed in some papers as well. And there was a nice review paper that I read this year that I believe was accepted and will be appearing soon. I can't remember who wrote it, or otherwise I would advertise it further. But anyway, it looked at, for example, the effect of screen resolution in VR displays and showed how the results of some perceptual experiments had changed based on that. So it was very cool.
I get about 2 years ago, no, maybe 4 years ago, there was floated the idea of an ACM AR VR conference, and it just sort of died. So I encourage some young Turks here to, resurrect. We need more high quality venues to publish in. I think that's part of the problem.
I'll mention also something that my lab has done to with nice effects, I think. And Bruce, maybe your lab too. But when a new student wants to get started, I'll often encourage them to try to reproduce an experimental method in an existing paper with the idea that we will then extend it in various ways. And the very next paper that I'm going to talk about is exactly this method.
So I think we have another question here.
Okay. This is very cool. I can see the camera panning now.
Hi, Gerald Thomas, Virginia Tech. Until we get to the point to where replication studies are just kind of part of the common publication process, do you have any suggestions for how we can encourage it as a community? So for example, a thought I have is by creating special topic publications of journals that we already published to, or create special tracks in conferences ahead of time where we publish only replication works.
I think a special track in a journal would be a great way to do it. I mean, this has to start kind of paper by paper. I don't think it's possible to suddenly have a whole new conference, based on this. Actually, this workshop is an example of it's a growth from something that started as a tutorial. The first time I did this, it was just me who did it. And then Arifin helped me do it. And now it's become a workshop. So there are some papers here that might not have been published otherwise. So I think this workshop is a great example of taking this topic to another level.
All right.
So thanks again to Jens and everyone else who has organized this. I mean, I'm listed as an organizer as well, but others did more than me.
So Ed, we have one more question, and before that, let me add to that exactly this workshop is one of the venues where you can publish your replications. And actually after the tutorial, we will have a list of papers who actually did this, right? So they took prior research either from their own group, from some others, and now we're just reporting on what our findings were compared to the original research.
So first, should I face to this okay? So thank you for talk, and by hearing your presentations, I came up with the one idea that I heard there's some in some experiment the publisher conduct the experiment, and this caused the error. I heard because the many authors have the motivation to they want to find out their significant difference from their studies, and because that if they can get their significant difference, that they can be accepted more maybe. But maybe this caused the error, and that's why the many studies cannot be replicated well. my question is that are there any like replication studies they targeted at their cause of error, for example, such as such as specific buyers or something?
So actually, if I understand the question correctly, it's, what you have re-mentioned the phenomenon of p-hacking, looking for a significant difference.
Yeah, like that.
And let me find it. This paper here. Oh, I got the Midas touch problem. I click it and then something else happens. This paper here by Ionides. It's a Greek name. I don't know if I'm saying it right. But why most published research findings are false. That's a pretty provocative title, but it's a paper that kind of studies the mathematics behind some of this phenomenon. And when I gave the longer version of this tutorial, spent an hour and a half or so exploring that more deeply. So this is a paper I could recommend. And this paper itself, published in 2005, that's almost 20 years ago. Reverse citation search would probably find some more modern papers that, consider these findings and maybe update them accordingly. This is also published in the very much in the medical field,
Okay.
but it's still, the mathematics of hypothesis testing.
Okay, thank you.
And we have another question. Second.
Hi, Ed. This is Gudrun Klinker from TU Munich.
Oh, Gudrun. Oh, I
Hi.
wish I was there.
Yes, nice to see you. Great talk, and I know you do this for several years now, and this is very important. But we talked already also now about how difficult it is to replicate something that was done on different hardware or in different settings before. And if you do this, for instance, in an industrial setting, it becomes even more difficult. Or also if you do user studies and you don't collect the same kind of population for your studies. So maybe as a question or suggestion, we may need to try to think about constants. So that like if we analyze how things fall to the ground, we may assume certain physical constants there. And that's something that we can try to measure across different experiments, if it's constant. But we may need to state what we think might be a constant that we can experiment upon. And maybe then like everything that we do not assume to be constant then is a confounding factor or something we haven't even thought about, like screen resolution or a bias in the population or things like that.
So I have a few thoughts there that those are very valid points. In terms of completely reporting details of an experiment, if say the screen resolution is reported, it's not always reported. If it's reported, if the brightness is reported, that's brightness, measured with a measuring device like a luminance meter or something like that, then it may be possible with future displays to decrease the resolution, establish the same brightness, and thereby get closer to a constant. Another idea, when possible, not always possible, but when possible, to have some control condition in the experiment be the real world, then that's going to be reproducible as well, more easily reproducible. So there's no easy answer or quick answer, but there's some ideas that I've thought of and others have thought of over the years.
Okay, I think we are running a little bit out of time, but we have one more question or comment. So please.
Yeah, I just have one more thought. So you talked about PBCG having a replication stamp and how that's not necessarily the replication that we're concerned with in an ACI community. It's more having to do with the software, the algorithm. Is there thoughts on your end for how we could incorporate a stamp like that for HCI type research?
Well, I think
and-
that stamp is meant to be broader than it was originally motivated by algorithmic reproducibility. But, you know, it can be applied to reproducibility in many dimensions. And I think the stamp is there. And in other communities, I think the stamp is used. I've never seen it on a paper from our community. But, you know, it is an example of something that exists. And it's an example of the fact that the editors of TVCG are also thinking about issues of repeatability. So it's a larger issue than just human subject studies.
Right.
You
But
know, it's a larger engineering issue as well.
is there a way that we can tie papers to their future replication papers using a stamp like that? Maybe one that gets updated that says this paper has this many replication studies with this results or something like that.
Well, and my soon-to-be former student Arifin actually has found some replication studies from the Chi community over the past 10 years and studied those.
Okay. Working? So as already mentioned, now Ed will continue with his paper also on the replication and give us some insights on that. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, so more of me talking, but this paper is, you know, one of the publications in the workshop proceedings. And let me start in on this. So this is supposed to take 20 minutes. Is that correct?
10 minutes presentation, 10 minutes questions.
Okay, okay. So this is an example of replicating a technique. The technique is called triangulation by walking. And the authors are Nate Phillips, Farjana Khan, Mohammed Arifin from my lab, Cindy Bethel, one of my fellow professors, and Janine Stefanucci, a colleague from the University of Utah. And so in augmented reality, X-ray vision, operators want to be able to see content beyond opaque surfaces. So this is known as X-ray vision. This has primarily previously been studied in medical applications, and these are tasks that occur in reaching space, so close in spaces. So in this work, we are interested in a remote robotic exploration seen through a virtual AR window. So here's a little concept diagram that we created. So we have some first responders here. This is something that, you know, really happens in industrial accidents and some police operations as well. So we have a room and it's full of smoke or, you know, dangerous substances. Here's somebody who's passed out. So the idea is to send a robot in, and the robot looks around with cameras, including maybe thermal cameras, things like that. And so this can already be done, but when this is done, the responders are looking at the point of view of the room through the cameras on the robot. And so you get this view as if, you know, you're lying down on the ground looking up. It's confusing and so forth. So the idea here, it's not a new idea, is to use augmented reality to create a virtual window. So the robot's view is then geometrically transposed so that it's as if you're looking through an actual window. And so the point is, this is X-ray vision, but it occurs in action space. So that's about 1.5 to maybe as far as 30 meters. So these are walking around distances. And so the first responders, what they seek is situation awareness of the room contents. So this is the scenario. So Blind walking is the most relevant technique for studying perceived distances at action space distances. And it has been widely applied to augmented reality. It's also been widely applied to virtual reality and to real objects. It's in applied perception and virtual environments, it's perhaps the most replicated technique that there is. And so it works. Observers see an object and they close their eyes and they walk without vision, or they put on a blindfold. Somehow they walk without vision towards the object. If it's a real object, the object either has to be something they can step on, or it has to be snatched out of the way once their eyes are closed. And people will walk until they believe they are at the location of the object. And when you first hear about this, when you first try it yourself, it seems like, how can this work? But it does work. People are actually quite good at this. So, however, it requires a clear pathway between the observer and the object. The observer cannot walk through something to get there. And so the research question here was, how do we measure this for objects seen through an AR virtual window that are located behind a wall? So this is the technique that we replicated in this work. And so this is a technique by Fukushima, Da Silva, and Loomis. This has nothing to do with virtual environments, it's real objects. And it's called the triangulation by walking method. And so we decided to replicate this. So imagine an observer looking through a wall. Where the wall ends, the observer can walk around the end of the wall here. So the general method, the observer stands at the origin, looks at the target, closes their eyes, they turn, they walk to the left or right. They reach a turning point, they turn towards the object, they take several steps, the experimenter instructs them to stop. This is the particular experiment in this paper that we replicated. Observer stands at the origin facing to the left or right, looks sideways at the target. They turn at 5 meters. The observer drags a heavy 2-meter chain. Once stopped, the observer places 2 golf tees. The experimenter places golf tees along the chain, which indicates a vector pointing towards the target. Observer makes 2 walks in quick succession, left then right or right then left. While the observer stands over here with their back to the field, the experimenter uses a device to measure the distance between the 4 golf tees and 2 calibration points. And the 4 positions are calculated using trilateration, which is a method from surveying. And the perceived target is defined as the intersection of the left and right walk vector. So this is what we wanted to replicate, and we call it the left-right method of perceived target location. So in the paper itself, Fukushima, Da Silva, and Loomis, they validated triangulation by walking with several experiments. This is one of those papers that has, I think, 5 experiments in it total. And they found similar results when observers kept their eyes open and did this. So you just open your eyes and do it, then you're looking right at the thing you're walking towards. So, you know, this should be very accurate. And they found pretty comparable accuracy out to about 15 meters. And then they replicated it again with some improvements to their method, and they found even better results. And here are their comparable results for blind walking. So, you know, the kind of the gold standard method here. So we performed a conceptual replication. We had to change details. And whenever a replication has happened in my lab, and I think most labs, you have to change some details, sometimes for very practical reasons. So first, where do we do this? You know, the location. So the original experiment was done in a grassy field, but we could not find a grassy field that was flat enough or large enough. So we chose a parking lot, which was very large and very flat. And we tested some different distances. We tested 6, 9, and 12 meters instead of going out as far as 18 or 24 meters, because the room clearing scenario is of interest for room scale distances. Our target was a soft drink can, a real object, and that's because we wanted to also study a virtual version of this can. Here, the soft drink can is covered in some green paper because we could make a color in the AR display that was a similar shade of green. And we could also verify that the location of the virtual object matched the real object by putting on the display and walking around and superimposing the two objects. So this was done on a Magic Leap 1 display. And then in terms of measuring positions, these are taken indoors, but we use this outdoors as well. We put a little hacky sack beanbag behind the feet. So we tried, putting a chain around our waist and walking around, but it felt very unnatural. And also this happened during COVID. Many of us tried to do some science during COVID, and we didn't want multiple people handling the chain. We'd have to somehow, clean the chain. I don't know. It just seemed, it seemed like the beanbag worked better. Another practical advantage of the beanbag is you can kind of toss it in place, and the beans in there, it kind of lands with a thud, and the motion is absorbed by the beans, and so it stays put. So the beans would absorb the momentum. And we use the same ultrasonic measuring device. So these are the kind of changes that almost always have to be done when trying to replicate something. And so here's what we found. And so these are top-down measures of the walked path. So the observer stood at the start point. Here we have at 6 meters, 9, and 12. Those are the 3 distances. And observers walked 3 times to the right and left. They stood at the start point. They walked blindly to the turn point, which is the green circle. They turned to face the target, and their position was marked. Then they made a few steps towards the target. They stopped, their position was marked. And we used the left-right method to compute the perceived target locations, and those are the purple circles. So we had a good match. Fukushima, De Silva, and Loomis, these are their results. And then our results on the same kind of graph. We had similar means and more accurate, smaller standard error bars. So we considered this to be a successful replication outdoors. But we really wanted to do this indoors because that's what our collaborators want to do. And so for the indoor setting, we got this indoor room. It's 6.25 by 8.2 meters. We also had to do it indoors, by the way, because you can't use augmented reality out of doors. We considered replicating it out of doors. This is also because of COVID, but for any commercially available display on a cloudy day, the virtual objects are dim and kind of look like ghost-like objects. And on a sunny day, they're invisible. So this is the room we had. And one wall features these tall windows going along the wall. Those become important later. We blocked the windows here. This is an interior hallway on this side. And we blocked the windows looking outside with thick cardboard. And we made a wall. This is made out of opaque fabric. It's light and can be moved, but also accurately positioned. And it had a window, and we positioned the wall so that the observer could look at the object through the window. And then for the triangulated walk, the observer, walks here and then turns and faces the object and takes a few steps closer. So we shifted the starting point. So here the observer is walking to their right. And when observers are going to walk to the left, we moved the wall over here. So then observers walked on this side. So we had to do that so that observers had enough space to do the walk. With this kind of blind walking, if people have to approach a barrier like this wall, too closely, it'll mess up the walk. So we had a neat way of measuring positions in this room. So the trilateration method that I mentioned took a long time to measure the position of the hacky sacks. So this room happened to have these square tiles, and we measured the square tiles. We found that they were very precisely positioned. And so walking in this room is like walking on a sheet of graph paper. It's very easy to calculate positions. And so we marked every square with coordinates, and we would then estimate the 10th digit. So for example, if this is square 310, then we might estimate this as being 3.7 along X and 10.4 along the Y dimension. So basically, this was very fast. It could be done by one experimenter. So the distances, we started thinking in terms of tiles. We used tile units in this room. So we measured distances of 12, 18, and 24 tiles, made it easy to accurately position the target. And these are, the meter distances that those mapped to. And we also included some confusion distances so that people would not be able to always expect, these three even distances. And then we wanted to mask the location cues from the sound of the experimenter's voice. So Fukushima et al. In that paper, they ruled out that participants were doing this, but we felt that we could clearly localize the experimenter based on where their voice was coming from within the room. So one experimenter was in the room making these measurements here, and the other experimenter stood outside these windows, and they called the participant on the participant's cell phone. Every participant had a cell phone, and almost every participant had their own earbuds or headphones. And we had some sanitized headphones available, but we almost never had to use them. And so the other experimenter stood behind these windows, watched what was happening, and communicated with the participant through a phone call. And participants could not localize the experimenter. It sounded like their voice just came out of their heads. So that was pretty cool. So now we've changed quite a few details of the method. And so these are what some of the paths look like for the left-right method for one of the participants. And here, these lines are the location of the walls. So during right-hand walks, the wall is here, and the target is in these three locations. These rectangles are the size and shape of the room itself. And so, for example, when doing right-hand walks, the observer observes, and then they walk to this turning point, and then they turn towards the object, and they take a few steps, and so forth. So we found some problems with the left-right method. We had to change the way this was calculated to address these problems. And both of these problems are exhibited here. So at the turning point, observers are turning to face the object. And if they turn too far inwards, then the perceived distance is underestimated. So if they go beyond this straight pathway between the turning point and the target, if they go too far, then it's underestimated. If they don't turn far enough, it's overestimated. And the triangulated calculations to determine location, those bias the position according to a tangent function. And so overestimation errors are much larger than underestimation errors. So here the overestimation errors are all like well past this far wall. Like they might have an error, they might have a distance of 80 meters or something completely unrealistic based on the size of the room. But If observers don't turn far enough, it's possible to get a negative measurement. In other words, a perceived distance being behind the observer. So that also doesn't make sense. So based on that, we tried analyzing with another method that we call the direct walk method. And so here you can imagine from the starting point, a vector that goes to the target. And when the turns are made, the perceived distance is the intersection between the turning point and the stopping point. That forms a vector. You extend that out, and wherever that vector intersects this vector, the observer is standing here, they're looking at the target. Whenever the pathway intersects this vector, that's the perceived location. So there's some improvement, and this still seems to capture the notion of a perceived location, but it still suffers from the same triangulated geometry calculations. And what we came to understand eventually was that the problem was the bias in the triangulated calculations. So both blind walking and triangulation by walking are perception action methods where the observer's perception is inferred from their action. And there are various reasons why this is used. It has lower cognitive biases than, say, verbally reporting the distance in feet or meters. In blind walking, the action is walking. So there's a very direct mapping to distance. In triangulated walking, the action is really the angle of this turn at the turning point. How far do you turn? So this suggested just analyzing the angular error directly instead of going through some triangulated calculation. And so here, if the angle is correct, then the observer is pointing directly at the target. And if it's not far enough, then it's an overestimated angle. And if it's too far, it's an underestimated angle. And so, you know, this is how we are now analyzing the data. And this also shows some of the confusion distances here. So this is a story of how we replicated triangulated walking, the changes we had to make. We extended it to examine X-ray vision, and the design trade-offs suggest the difficulties of performing a direct replication for any method. And we have a better understanding, we think, of how to analyze the results from triangulation by walking. And so we could have maybe some discussion.
Okay, thank you. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Ed. Bruce again. The discussion you had there was very interesting. This iterative approach to coming to some conclusion, and this gets back to what you were talking about in your previous talk about page length. So when we run studies, this is not the replication, but this is about studies in general, is that we pilot a bunch of ideas and then we throw away the pilot study. Nobody gets to see it. And we're trying to, you know, narrow down to an interesting or surprising result, as it were. What I liked about what you did is you explained, well, how did you, all the steps you got to the conclusion that you got to, as opposed to, oh, well, we found this way, this measure, and this told you the best way to measure it. And I would add that having these other design ideas, pilot ideas, they should all be incorporated into the paper to give a better indication of how you got the result. And when you go to replicate the result, you realize that there are these little factors inside of it that change the actual results that you got. I think I'm rambling here, but
So I appreciate you saying that. I will mention, so this is another example. Let me just go to the very first slide. Okay, so this is my recently graduated former PhD student, Nate Phillips. This is his dissertation. If you were to get his dissertation and read that, you would read this story, part of a much longer story. I don't think the content of this paper would have ever been accepted if it had just been submitted directly to, the conference. I mean, that's not the kind of work that is. So you're correct in that this is the kind of thing that happens in many labs, but is not typically published. So I think that's another very nice thing about this workshop.
Yeah, Ed, I also have a question. I was fascinated by your concerns about the person, the observer speaking to the test persons and having the mobile phone to be part of this. Of course, this has not been done in the original experiments, and so I'm wondering about sound in general, ambient sound. How much of a support is this for helping people to navigate and find their own positioning in an environment? There might just be birds chirping or cars driving by. Do you think that has had an influence?
So actually, this was
experiment?
done in the original experiment. So in the original experiment, it was a little like a walkie-talkie, and the observer was listening through headphones to a walkie-talkie. So something very similar was done in the original, 20 years ago. It wasn't a cell phone. The cool thing was that almost everybody had their own earbuds, not just everyone had a phone. So that was neat. And so it has been shown in perceptual experiments that people can localize sounds with their eyes closed. And in fact, that can be a conflicting location cue. In this kind of experiment, you close your eyes and the experimenter is telling you what to do, and you can hear where they are standing in the room, and you can hear when they move somewhere else in the room so that you don't run into them. You can not only hear their voice, you can hear their footsteps. And so this was a nice way to get rid of all that.
Thank you. I think we're already a little over time, so if there are no urgent questions, I would continue with the lunch break. Okay, yeah. So we'll see each other again on at 1.
Okay, thank you so much. See you then. And Ed, thank you once more for that presentation. Thank you so much.